Welcome. I'm so happy to see you all here today. I'm Loretta Yarlow, Director of the University Museum of Contemporary Art, the UMCA. This symposium, Art+Math Equals, has been organized in conjunction with our year-long exhibition program that focuses on the intersection of art and math. So one of the goals of Art+Math Equals is to bring the UMass STEM and art communities together into discussion with one another and to celebrate the groundbreaking work by leaders in these fields. These speakers were selected based on their innovative interdisciplinary research. They come from a diverse range of disciplines here at UMass: civil engineering, mathematics, music, studio arts, and architecture. I want to express my gratitude to them all for so kindly giving their generous time and sharing their expertise throughout the day. I mentioned Zylo Jane's exhibition of paintings at the UMCA, which was one of the inspirations for the symposium. I want to say that she is the epitome of art plus math in the merging of her own artwork. And today at 5 p.m. we'll premiere a new documentary film that we commissioned here at the museum. And the filmmaker Kate Giles will be here for a Q&A at the screening at 5 o'clock. So if any of you have to run out, please come back for 5 o'clock. It's about a 15-minute video, which we'd love to have you see. As a reminder, tomorrow night at 7:30, please join us for a concert, Art and Math Equals Music, at Bazan Recital Hall. The full evening program is also featured on the program notes that we have here. And we're delighted to have a keynote address, speaker, and music by leading composers. So information, again, is in the program notes. I want to clearly thank the people who organized this symposium. Without their great expertise and organizational skills, this couldn't have happened. So Bibiana Medkova, an MFA graduate student in the art department and graduate assistant last summer at the UMCA. She's the lead planner, organizer, mastermind behind the symposium and concert. I want to express my gratitude to Bibiana as well as to Amanda Herman, our education curator at the UMCA, who they both worked closely and tirelessly for a full year to organize these events. So congratulate to you both for this. I want to acknowledge the Department of Music for their collaboration, and in particular to thank Professor Ayano Katoka, who curated tomorrow's concert program along with Bibiana. We're incredibly grateful to the women of UMass Amherst who recognized the importance of our project and gave their full support. They're a network of alumni who promote the advancement of campus programs that provide access, support, and opportunity for UMass Amherst students, with preference to those projects that positively impact UMass Amherst women and their respective communities. And finally, thanks also must go to the Arts Extension Services and those here in the design building who have given us this beautiful space for our conference. And reminder to come visit the museum. Our exhibitions will be on view till the end of April. I'm going to hand this over now to the three speakers. Our first panelists, Bibiana Kapur, Giloth, Jazer, Giles.
So the first panel is computers and creative disciplines. So most of the work that I'm going to be showing, some of it is sort of recent studies. This is an example from Data Long. It's a 4K video, 2018. And it's a different way of looking at data captured with 13 infrared cameras in the kinesiology department. So basically, it's just a massive data set of files of 4 points floating in space, so in 3 dimensions, over time. So, and in this particular case, this set is about 15 seconds. So looking at human modeling and how it inserts unpredictability, or at the very least sort of irregularity in a straightforward movement. And this is how the software, which by the way was not designed to work with large volumes of essentially text or data, this is how it sort of parses out the information. With each frame, it has to recalculate the varying column widths, so there are mild changes in the system that trigger a system-wide change, sort of. So pretty sort of straightforward test of just looking at things. From the same kinesiology lab study, this is data short, also in 4K, also 2018, using the same 13 infrared camera setup. So this is a much shorter data set. In this case, it's about 5 seconds. In this video, the data is automated by a machine, and Premiere is directly processing in the previous work, in the white one, it was manually overridden by the operator because the data set was too large at 15 seconds. It was too large for the machine to actually handle. So in the white one, the scroll is actually done by an operator manually, literally with a scroll wheel on a computer in text edit. And you can see that the way that it calculates the columns in the shorter set, the variation is much smaller in the visualization of the data. An example from 7 derivatives of an RGB waveform, also 2018, 4K. In this study, I was looking at the particular color spectrum of late fall New England light. I'm interested in the translation of the camera. It transcribes this, or how I'm interested in the translation of information between spaces. So here the reality or the world is captured using a camera. The camera transcribes this information into sRGB color space. And then upon compressing the raw camera data, the information is viewed on a monitor in Adobe RGB color space. And in case you work on a Mac, it's in 5K resolution. And then worked in a professional video editing software. But once you work inside of video editing software, you're actually working inside of television color space. And then it's exported back out into internet color space, which goes back to sRGB. So there are different things that sort of happen at each one of these steps. And I'm actually using the titling for this is called a derivative, which is a calculus term. And we'll talk about this hopefully in the discussion a little bit. All of these examples so far have been bypassing any lens-based and light-based capture of information in video and photography. So here is a still from a newer work called Fred Astaire, Daddy Longlegs, which is sort of 2019. So it's dance and movement and music working together. And all of these graphs are different visualizations. Actually, most of it is sound. Some of it is the video information in the original work from the 50s. So here is a little reveal where you can see some of the original video in the back. And all of these recordings, each one of these are presented in real time. So this piece is about 5 minutes. Here is a patch for a live music performance. I think most of the sound processing here, at least, relies on algebraic relationships. So you're controlling it live not by feel or by hearing, but by numbers. So there are numerous places. Actually, there are probably like 20 different parameters that you can change in here. Here's another little script written in Max, which inserts chance operation. You can see down where the random parameters are inserted. So going back to the human gait that I was looking at with the infrared cameras, which record sort of an irregularity in a pretty straightforward movement. But even the movements in the tightly choreographed Astaire sequences are not perfect. And you can see some of the in the video. If you were to watch the video, you can see the movement happen through the visualization of the movement. So this distinguishes completely computer-generated works, and think like Berlin techno, right? It has this like super regular structure to it. Computers have their own language, and when you listen to them, sort of you acknowledge the structure of how they're built. So, and here are some other examples of works which are more complete and finished pieces of work. So these images were captured with an electron microscope. So these are cultural artifacts put under at really high resolution. And electron microscopes, again, don't use any light or optics or the SEM, which I was using in this particular case. All it does is read, it shoots electrons at the object that you place underneath the microscope, and it reads the fall of the electrons. So it's a very different sort of directly digital process of capturing images. And I was looking at this resolution to see whether content can sustain multiple translations, and if the signification of the content is still legible once it's at really high resolution and it's not recognizable visibly. And here are some examples of finished works actually installed in a gallery. So, Kapur.
Good afternoon. My work is usually formulated within a computer. For any of you who know me, most of my current work involves the building of a 17th century, the reconstruction in 3D of a 17th century labyrinth that no longer exists. You can see it in the Digital Media Center in the library if you want to. But for this presentation, I used grids, numbers, puzzles, newspaper data, A4 paper, and pens to construct stories about my daily existence by juxtaposing fragments of newspaper stories with something solvable, the Sudoku puzzle. I embarked on this journey in September of 2012, and it lasted for 2 years, or 1,468 drawings later. I have talked about this process, this project, in many ways, but today I'm going to focus on the process. These drawings emerged from the Sudokus in French and American newspapers and were created by combining the process of solving the Sudoku with what I digested from the day's newspaper content. Installing the project in the fall of 2015 at UMass's Herder Art Gallery was the only time I have shared the entirety of this relentless, daily structured visual reflection. Taking several weeks to install the work, I had the opportunity to see my number puzzle solving adventure spread out on the walls. Immersed in a room filled with A4 paper drawings dominated by the omnipresent Sudoku puzzle allowed for the possibility to see visual connections made by the interconnecting lines and stories of my drawings. Most French newspapers use the basic Sudoku puzzle, but the International Herald Tribune, now the International New York Times, uses one with an additional 3x3 grid embedded for more complexity. I hand-copied the seed numbers on my custom grids. The project began when I arrived in France in 2012. It was a way to share puzzles and to track my day and location, and to build a ritual for my semi-nomadic existence. Morning is my time of day, surrounding the puzzle with clues to its solution and all the unsolvable information in the newspaper became the world I operated in every day. It seemed so American that sports and puzzles lived on the same page. There was always an answer. The French newspapers always had the saint of the day. Above is the first and last Sudoku. Most of the Sudokus have been solved, but by the end of 2 years, the drawings had taken over and there was almost no time left to solve the actual puzzle. I started with white paper, but eventually got bored, and introduced color and transparent papers and used colored pens. As my drawings progressed, I did color theory experiments where sometimes the puzzles became impossible to solve because they became invisible or they got lost in the drawing. These drawings were done in isolation from other people, which is mostly how I work. But in February 2013, I emailed pictures related to the day's Sudoku to my niece Elizabeth, and she mailed back objects as responses. Displayed above the Sudoku pages are our intertwined visual and verbal exchanges. Images of walnut calendars and small objects constructed with fruit papers and other daily artifacts got mailed back and forth between France and the United States. Sewing lines and adding other materials started to be incorporated in and around the A4 page. My process changed dramatically into a move towards a formal narrative when I walked the 500-mile Camino de Santiago de Compostela. I had to forage for newspapers and copy them, and when I returned, I reconstructed the pages, adding stories from my walk and a few comments about world events. My color structure emulated the Camino signs, and my sewing held together the stories and escapades of the walk. After the walk ended in early June, my ideas about how to make the daily pages evolved more towards working on sections based on my current location and integrating both the news and my personal reflections. Then I stopped. The pages were filed into notebooks by month, 25 notebooks. Reading them by month in a book format allows the viewer to experience an integration of the daily stories as they evolve and connect over time and to view the drawings in double columns that form a different complex picture because of the transparent papers. On the left is the exhibition poster showing a grid of 2 years, or 1,468 drawings organized by month. Believe it or not, this project continues on as I use a more sporadic approach to the juxtaposition of the solvable with the now even more horrific details of modern life that too often seem to have no solutions. Thank you.
I use math and computers all the time in my work, but I thought I would speak specifically about the piece that I made for the concert tomorrow night. I decided to use an algorithm to help me compose this piece. The algorithm that I chose to use is called elementary cellular automata. And basically what that means is you take lines of pixels, great, thank you, and decide using rules to what the next generation of cells is going to look like. So this is an illustration of that. You can see the rules in action. This is actually the rule that I used. The reason I use this rule is this algorithm results in 4 classes of results. The first class of results is quickly the image goes completely white or completely black, which obviously wouldn't make for great musical fodder. The second class of outcomes makes a regular pattern. This, for instance, is one of those patterns. This is a very famous pattern. This is the Sierpinski triangle. It's a fractal. Inside of each of the, as you zoom in, it's copies of itself, you know, at infinitum into the screen. Also, maybe wouldn't make amazing musical fodder. It's very repetitive. It would change. The way that I sort of implemented this algorithm was to think of each horizontal line as a set of events. So to make the sort of rhythmic elements of the music. And so if you kind of went across, you can see that you get a very regular pattern. It wouldn't be super interesting. Anyway, I didn't use this class. The next class results in seemingly random patterns. They're obviously not actually random because this is a very deterministic algorithm. But you can see what it looks like. And it looks pretty random, and you can't see a lot of patterns. And I didn't think this would make for great musical fodder either, because it would just sound pretty random. And the fourth class of results is somewhere in between the random and the pattern. So there are bits of patterned sections and also clumps of random or seemingly random sections. And here is an image of that rule in place, and you can see some patterns that are moving across, and also clusters of more complex areas. So this is called Rule 110 because the way this algorithm works is let me go back to the, so each cell is determined by the 3 cells of the generation before, the cell itself, and the 2 cells to the left and the right. So there are 2 possible states, 3 variables, that's 2 to the 3rd power combinations. You can see there's 8 possible things. That means it's an 8-bit algorithm, which means there are 256 different rules. This rule 110 comes from the fact that in 8-bit, that's our 1, our 2, our 4, our 8, our 16, our 32, our 64, and our 128 value. And if you add up the dark spots of those numbers, it would add up to 110. So that's where the 110 comes from in this rule. Here's it got written in JavaScript to generate it. This is the code that I used. It's mostly some setup. There's a function that generates the new cells. The rule set's a little bit cut off down here. But basically, the 1 would be the cell. A is the cell to the left, B is the cell in the middle, and C is the cell to the right. And if they're, for instance, all white, then you're going to return rule set 0. Which is defined somewhere else on the outside. I'm passing that in at the top there as a rule set. So that's the code that I use. So that's sort of the mathematical way that I use this algorithm, sort of in a direct generative sense. I also sort of abstract this idea in maybe a more musical sense. For instance, I abstracted the idea to, I made a bunch of music, and then I applied some effects to that music, sort of creating a next generation of music, and then I sort of applied more effects to that music. Could have been the same effects or some different effects, and in that way I sort of built up these generations of music, and I combined them later to then create the sort of fixed part of the media that's going to be part of the performance. I also, in writing the score for Ayano to Play, I actually sort of drew from another form of cellular automata, the two-dimensional form. In the two-dimensional cellular automata, the patterns sort of spread out on the page as they evolve. And so what I did was I wrote the music as small musical phrases and put them on the page in a way that Ayano could play in a course that she chose, from phrase to phrase and with different amounts of time in between, such that her path on the page of music sort of emulated that growing cellular automata in 2 dimensions. I also, the name of the piece is called Nidus, and that word means nest. And specifically it means sort of a teeming clump of life. And so I tried to incorporate that into the sort of aesthetics of the piece, into the sounds that were being made. I was trying to make this sort of teeming life feel. And then I also thought of the word nest, meaning this sort of tightly woven structure that doesn't really have any sharp edges in it. So I used all of that to sort of inspire the piece. And if you come tomorrow, you'll hear it.
I've definitely observed a lot of mathematical rules in all of this work. There seems to be a grid structure and the breaking of a grid structure with both of the sets of works. I mean, the Pseudocool definitely sort of has a very fixed grid. Did you ever look at any of the graph theory copper that's behind Pseudocool? Or do you use the graph theory calculations?
What you end up seeing in these pictures is that the main thing I do is, I originally envisioned this project as everyone would come do Pseudocools. They would all come these. And then when I showed that to somebody, they said, why would you want anyone to touch them? And I said, well, I set them up for people to be able to answer them. So what I did was, these are the numbers that are given to you, and these are me counting up what are the clues that are in there. And it's very useful to know what is there the most and what is there the least. And so then my drawings were based off that. So the thing in this one that's the most is the 4. Whereas on this one, I went for what was the least, which was the 7. So you can use, and then over here, I did it with this. So you can use that information to try to help you solve the Sudoku, so that it was set up as something that you could do it. But I didn't want to get into the formal theories with anybody on how to do it. I wanted to visually do it. And then you can see in most of the drawings that the drawings all started with those numbers. So it was sort of an arbitrary way to start the drawings based on what were the most important numbers.
I find it interesting because when we talked, I thought all of your work was always digitally fabricated, I suppose, or at least our discussion in the summer was all about your coding. So how do you decide when you work more within the digital environment and when you work in an analog setting? I guess that's more of a question just for copper, because you work exclusively. Well, that's not true, yeah.
I've been working in a digital environment on all my work since 1978. And when I was doing this work, I think that somebody who would work digitally would work this way, because if you look back at all of my work, starting with the idea of my work being based on quilts and other kinds of grids, if you look through all my work, you would see that that would make sense. At this particular time, I was, at the same time that this was going on, I was teaching myself how to do augmented reality. And I was learning, I was dealing with maps and teaching a lot of digital software to myself. And I think that it was really good for me to be thinking about my ideas in a non-digital, in an analog way, so that if you go, some of those pieces end up being the research I was doing at Versailles, where my 3D reconstruction using augmented reality, photogrammetry, and other very mathematically based projects were going on. And I think this was a way for me to bring it back in a personal way.
I've seen some analog integration into your performance works. Can you talk a little bit about the intersection of the digital environment and coding and the analog processes in your work?
I mean, I guess at the end of the day, we're always viewing these things as humans in space. So there's always sort of an analog end to everything. And sometimes that means it's a musical performance with a human being. And the interfacing of that human with the computer is a very sort of complicated process of letting the person know what's happening and when to do things and when things are happening, but also so much stuff is behind the scenes. So when I write a score for somebody, what do I notate for them to know what's happening in the computer part? Mm-hmm. How is it important to them? How do I visualize that? Because it's not usually in normal notation, though I'm writing normal notation for an instrumentalist to play on an analog instrument. And so what's that interface? And then also, how do I interface that analog instrument with the computer, microphones, pickups, what sort of things? How do I transcode that information into the computer land? Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of forward analog to digital, and then at the end there's a lot of digital back into analog, be it a score or a video or a sound.
Through your presentation, it seems there's definitely a network of ideas happening. There's a lot of back and forth. And so there are multiple steps within a particular sequence of events, right? And then you have sequences and subsequences and everything sort of self-referenced within one another. So both as a composer and as a video maker, how do you think can you expand on the idea of a sequence in your work? And also, how do you think steps in a sequence work within timelines, right? Because steps and sequences are definitely mathematical ideas. And so even though you're not thinking of them in a strictly fixed mathematical sense, we're sort of using these concepts and language which comes from that trajectory. And so how are you essentially applying it in your work?
There's always a sort of conundrum in music and in many things where we deal with time in a relative sense. So a piece of music, a musician is going to feel a certain musical phrase at their own tempo, but a computer does not care. Computer has a very rigid set of time, and it's all proportional to itself, where it's like, okay, I know this is 1 second, and I can only base things off of this very concrete thing. There's no play in that. And so sequencing in a computer is speaking this language that isn't necessarily a human understanding of time. Because our idea of time changes. If we're busy, it feels like it goes by fast. If we're bored, it goes by slow. Computer doesn't care about any of that. So when I make a piece of music that's very much a time event, it's demarcating time with events, this process of figuring out how to get the human musician to understand that timing and be able to interpret it in a human way as opposed to a totally rigid set of numbers or a grid of time. And that's always a problem. It's really, and those problems are what make it a fun project. It's like problem solving, figure out how to do that.
I like that you're blending pretty fixed ideas, or not fixed, but sort of more rigid structures like the Sierpinski triangle, which is not a rigid structure. I mean, there's definitely an element of growth in fractals, and but that the recursive self-similarity makes it a very regular pattern, right? And then you're inserting these sort of irregular notions into it and mixing the two together. Which I think maybe Kapur you're sort of doing because you're working in analog, and I was really interested in the way that you use drawing when you make these larger grids, because the Pseudocool grid within the larger grid of the drawings, there is something. It's like going back to a tiling structure, right? And maybe in arts we use a grid is sort of become one of the very standard presentation modes. can you maybe talk a little bit about each Sudoku? Sometimes Sudokus have a unique solution to them, correct? Right? Not always.
Most of the time.
Most of the time, right? So how does that idea of a unique solution, which we can also parallel to a unique artwork, maybe, how does that relate to this arrangement of tiling and grids and nodes and networks, right? So there's a sort of a tension within there of the unique versus the structured. Have you thought about that, or?
Well, I'm thinking about it now. You know, I used a chronological order. So basically, that shows that that's August, April, June, and August. It shows those are the ones that I did in that month. So I did a chronological ordering. And I experimented, but I didn't take a lot of pictures with a lot of ways to look at this work. Because someone said to me, well, there's only 28, 30, or 31 days in a month. Why aren't they all the same? And that's because each day I would do a French and an American newspaper. But if I changed my location, then I had to get another newspaper for the new location. So sometimes I'd move to multiple locations. And so I think I got as high as 89 because I was really moving a lot. So I thought about, could I organize these by when I was in Versailles, when I was in Paris, when I was in Seattle, so there were other ways to think about organizing the stories. Instead, I just simply did it by month. And I did find, when you look at these, that clearly in June of 2014, after returning from the Camino de Santiago, I decided I was just going to keep going with green and blue. So I was influenced, green and blue, yellow and blue. I was influenced by my physical surroundings. And I think that over the period of my career, it's been very hard to explain how influenced I am by what's actually outside of me once everyone sees me producing things from inside a computer. And it's easier for me to talk about it here because it's very obvious. You know, I started changing papers. I fell in love with this transparent paper that was sold in one store in Paris. You know, and I think the guy thought I was nuts because I bought hundreds of dollars of this paper, but I didn't know any place else to get it, and I found it randomly. And so it completely influenced. Look there I was, I found it in June, and by August I had multiple colors, I'd been back. You know, and, you know, whereas if you go to further, look where I started, you know, and then I got involved with black paper. And I really did, and then I had 250 pens. It's impossible that I could be so portable, but to start thinking about whether a Sudoku has one solution or two solutions. I always thought it was funny when I could tell when it had 2 or 3 solutions to it. I thought, wow, I've done this too many times. That compared with everything that I was reading in the newspapers, the part that I can't explain is that I was reading French and American newspapers about the same horrific topic. So I'd be reading, one of the things that I read about was this very terrible rape that was in India, and the bus and everything, and I was reading it in French and English, and it was interesting to see the different points of view which come out in my stories, but only somebody who looks at it in a book format would ever see it, would ever see those kind of stories multiplying through. And they weren't particularly solvable, whereas the part about the Sudoku was that you could come up with an answer. There was an answer there. That was real. For some reason, that was a really, and it was like I felt like I could come up with answers in computers with my computer. But the problem was that with making things with computers, I could come up with multiple answers. There were multiple answers, just like there were multiple answers outside. And I think that explaining once again that concept to people, that there were multiple answers, and that you have to just decide where you're going to go. You did a good job explaining that, you know. It's like there is no right answer. But with a Sudoku, it felt very comforting.
It's interesting that you're meshing sort of two different grid systems, that your use of the calendar also as a measuring device for this project. So
I have one more thing to add to that. Something that was surprising and became very important was the French desire to tell you the saint of the day. Not only in some papers, they needed to tell you what the saint was going to be the next day. I thought, wow, okay, I got the saint today. And then saints couldn't be the same on the same day necessarily every year because they might get bumped by a holiday. So I did it long enough that I realized this moving of these saints around as something that was important to be there in those newspapers as a system for gridding the year.
That's funny because we do have saints also in Czech Republic, which is
I
Catholic.
bet.
But it's fixed to that particular date, and so that's how you get your name date, because you're named after.
See, I thought that was true, and then they changed it. Because I think there are some saints that are really important. And then I found out about them and what they stood for, which was remarkable.
Right, yeah. So the sort of the Gregorian calendar and the astrological movement of the celestial bodies, right? Sort of somehow indirectly referencing this work through the use of the calendar. So how do you guys address repetition within your work? I mean, and I think that maybe this will be answered in a different way. But I am also interested in your sense of order within a composition, because Kapur referenced chronological order in her work, and I was wondering if you also jump around within the score to go from different segments of it or different subsequences of it back and forth, or if you have a chronological progression in the work, and which I suppose would make the analog score with Ayano integrate easier.
I'll answer the second part first because that's the one I'm remembering. The music has a long history, and it has a lot of formal elements in it that we inherit without knowing it necessarily. And so when I create things, I often end up falling into a musical form that is not unlike other music, in that there's sort of an introduction part that then transforms into something that is more exciting or less exciting, and there's a sort of trajectory of events that, at the end of the day, obviously is an acoustical event, and we have sort of an idea of what we like about that, or at least what I have an idea about what I like about that. And I try to honor that and acknowledge that when I'm making the thing. And it does help very much when you are interfacing with an actual human being to have a set trajectory in place, or at least if that is not in place, that it's very clear when it is not in place, so that the performer knows that this section is set and knows what to expect, and then in this section it might be random or different. Here's the ways that it might be different, so that it's not a surprise entirely, though the actual content may be a surprise. And obviously with computers, repetition is very easy. It might be the easiest thing, and so I'm often fighting against that. I'm often fighting against the easily repetitive patterns, so that it's not just it's not totally boring.
Right.
Even if those patterns are complex, they can still become this sort of repetitive, not exciting. It doesn't transform. It doesn't have the musical form I'm looking for.
Right.
It's hard to break in and out of repetition. Those transitions between those moments is always a touchy thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that generally people who work within the digital environments seem to fall into two camps. One is which fully embraces the rigidity of the digital environment and makes like that really structured, super mathematically synced work, whether visual or audio. And then the other camp is usually fighting against it and trying to insert the human chance element or the human hand into the digital environment. And I kind of see a tension of both within your work. Kapur, repetition. Do you have anything to say?
Well, I made 1,468 drawings that I put up here. So,
All at the same size, right? Correct?
I love A4 paper. Okay, so there's some measurements. There's just, and I did a little research before this to see if I could justify why I love A4 paper. It's something about it's thinner. I like the way it works. I like the the proportions of it. But it's not connected to anything special. It's not connected to the Fibonacci series. It's not connected to anything that I could justify it. I just have to say that I do. I also fell in love with being in this place that did things with centimeters. So, I mean, I was born to be there. I wasn't born to be with inches. So, I discovered that. I wrote this article when I was a young person, and now I'm old. I wrote this person about why I hated paint programs, like Photoshop. Even before that, I'm so old that I tested the first version of Photoshop. I tested things like that. And I thought that if you used that, then anything you made was really based on someone else's intelligence and not your own. Whereas if you programmed a computer, if you wrote the programs, then it was pure. But actually, since I went back to learn how to program in assembly language so that I could write my own basic interpreters and I could write my own computer languages, I realized that all those computer languages are built on someone else's intelligence. Now, I tried to justify this as a way for me that would be reasonable so that I wouldn't be making art that was totally based on this is what I was thinking in 1978. That it wouldn't be totally based on male intelligence, okay? And I realized I might have to give up then, even though I could go back in time and think about Ida Lovelace and her contributions. I'd still have to go back further to the Jacquard loom, which was one of the really early precursors. So I felt there was no pure way, so I didn't think there was any problem with me drawing stuff and making these Sudoku grids, which I saw in a certain way connected with the geometry and mathematics that women used in quilts. So I had many justifications, and now it's just fine to do whatever you want. But I do have this article called The Paint Problem, which really lays out why this is really a bad thing to do. But it was written a long time ago. And to my students, when I was doing this, I almost gave this little talk today to my students, and then I decided, no way, they got their own problems. And but I wanted to say that I try to get them to get to solution 10 before they implement a project. And I'm only sort of a lot of times I'm not very good at that. I just can't get them to 10 idea. So I thought if I told them it took me 1,468 to maybe get to a place, or that there were places along the way, there are places along the way where other projects left because something I discovered, the interaction of something in the newspaper and something in this particular Pseudocool, like I failed. One of the other things that you'll see in these books is how sometimes I failed on the Sudoku and I made a problem, so I write in wrong. And sometimes it says wrong like 3 or 4 times. Whereas I'd never do that on a drawing. I'd just go, oh, I'll do something else. So anyway, I think you should be repetitive.
So there are 2 things that have come up that I want to parse out. Computer languages. I know that you code in Java. JavaScript, sorry. And I was reading last night when I was looking at your slides about fractals. And it seems that fractals are usually coded in Java. I don't know if there's like a specific thing for that. Is that why you code in JavaScript, or are there other reasons?
No, the reason I chose to write that particular code in JavaScript is it was easy to implement in Max, and I was using Max to do MIDI and synthesis. And so the JavaScript is really good for object-based programming, where you can program arrays into place and get that information out by array, which in some programs is not as easy to do. In Max, it's not as easy to do. I could have written that same set of code in Jitter because I needed a larger array than a single message or a list. So it could have been done in a number of ways. Fractals are a recursive programming entity, and you can code them in any kind of thing. I usually actually code them in GLSL because I'm usually trying to make a visual representation, and GLSL is visual coding language. That one is less easy to code it in actually because that is written on the GPU, and GPUs are very bad at looking around themselves. Each pixel only really knows about itself. So it's harder to do that in GLSL than in other languages, but it works. So you can write a fractal in anything. And really, fractal is just simply referring to a algorithm that you can keep repeating that doesn't go to infinity.
Right.
That's basically all it is. So.
And I think the mathematics of fractals is also used under some of the algorithms that do image compression for those of you who work in photography. So can we just very quickly talk about your selection of color? I know this comes up very obviously in Copper's work, but I know in your video work, the color palette that you work with is very specific. So if you guys can just quickly address that, and then we'll open it up to the audience.
Color space is super fascinating to me. I like the idea of thinking of it as an actual physical space. And then when I am coding things that are emulating physical spaces, I like to use that information to create the color space so that there's this weird connection between, either like a GL, sphere or a shape, and the color space that I'm looking at. So I think mostly the things that I choose come from that sort of exploration, thinking of it as a three-dimensional, because usually, or four-dimensional, usually colors, as Viviana was mentioning, is in some sort of vector space. So red, green, and blue, each pixel has a vector associated with it. And obviously vectors you can think about in actual space as movement or a velocity or all kinds of things. So.
I think that in most of my work, I tend to work in black and white and then decide on some color. In this project, I was controlled with my color based on the paper I could buy. And I just would be drinking my coffee in the morning because I did all of this work between 6 a.m. and 8:30. And I just, if I got a run with wanting to work with blue or black, then that's what I did. And then something changed my mind. Sometimes the lighting wasn't good enough. So I've used it as a time to think about how could I make colors change. And then that became a subtext for how could I make things work in a different way. And I don't think I'd ever worked with such random color before. Because I think when I look at most of my pieces, they're because of this whole labyrinth thing, everything seems green because it's out in the garden. So this may have just been okay, you can go wild.
I have sort of a similar question to each person that has to do with the relationship or the connection between the product, the real world, and the computer stuff. And for me, there was a disconnect, and it might have been clear to you all, but it were just something I didn't get in each presentation. For the first one, what was exactly happening, I just didn't see what the data was representing in the real world. You just mentioned that it was a kinesthesiology experiment, and then went on to just talk about all the numbers, but I had no sense for what the numbers were representing. And in the math thing, music can be broken down into pitch and timbre and rhythm, and presumably your black and white bits, the algorithm generated stuff that made the music, but I didn't know what the connection was. I mean, what was generating pitch, what was generating rhythm? I mean, there was something missing to get from the grids with the algorithms and the black and white stuff and the actual music. There was a gap in my mind as to how that went from the algorithm to the actual music. And in the third one, it seemed very personal. I didn't get what the computer was doing. You did the Pseudocool, and you wrote stuff from the newspaper, but I didn't understand what part of it was digital. And you said you lived in the digital world and you've been doing digital stuff for decades, but it wasn't clear to me from your presentation what the digital stuff was.
There was no digital.
Ah, well, that's a big thing. Okay.
I mean, it was about numbers.
So the black and white specifically was generating the rhythmic element of the music. So I imagined each scan line as a line of music. I broke it up into 64 16th notes. And each line, if it was a white pixel, was a note event. And the music is a linear progression in time, just like a linear progression from left to right from each scan line in the image itself. So that was generating the rhythm. That was a different process. There's lots of processes. That was one of them. Yeah. But I took one ways that it did pass into the pitch, and other part was that I abstracted the idea into generations of effects. So I made a bunch of music. I applied an effect to it. It resulted in a new generation of music. I applied effects to that again. So there was sort of another generation of pitches to that.
And for the first one, the question, what does the data represent in the data sets that I collected? So it's a body moving through space for 15 seconds in a straight line. And it was literally me walking with a camera, and there were 4 points on the camera. So the system was only collecting coordinates for those 4 points, which is roughly the intersection between those 4 points would be where the center of the lens as it views the world. And it records those coordinates in X, Y, Z in millimeters, so it's very specific. And then the 4th dimension is time, or the 4th data set is time. So that's the data that I was working with, is basically the movement of a camera in space over a short period of time.
I still can't visualize it. There's you as a body in a room, and what is anesthesiology? I was thinking anesthesiology. But that's
Oh, no, yeah, so the study of movement, because they do these, I was running my own experiment using their equipment, the same thing as when I was in chemistry using their equipment, which they usually do to study molecular structures. I was looking at cultural artifacts. So I'm sort of subverting these systems, which are intended to do something else. And I'm basically just sort of looking at them and how they can interface with my work or things that I'm looking at.
I'm interested in the fact that you're using a certain structure, the grid structure, but now you're also working on a labyrinth using 3D modeling, and that the saints have an underlying structure also, which is like, one of the saints you had up there was the protector of hunters. And I was thinking
like that
of,
one.
huh?
I like that one.
And people in trouble, and those
Yeah,
in trouble.
I like that one too.
And I was thinking of Diana, the goddess of the huntress or something. And so I was just wondering if you were looking at, as you were thinking about this, like the structure underneath the structure. You know how the saints have mythical goddesses and gods underneath the structure of the saints in different cultures.
I have about 10 books on saints now. Because, I thought, okay, I've gotten into this. Okay, here's another set of books I can acquire so that I can learn more about these saints. And now they don't have a system. And so I haven't gotten much further with it, but there are a lot of interesting saints out there. The other thing is, because of working on this labyrinth project that is totally computer-based, this becomes a labyrinth in a certain way also. So it's the concept, I got into the concept of a labyrinth and where do you actually go. I know the first question was complicated and you didn't understand, and you said you didn't see how I used a computer in this. All the diagrams are printed on the computer, and all the information is in a computer, and there were various stages where I thought this would become something else, like this would become one of my 3D models so that I could walk through it, so that I could walk through that labyrinth in it. It's just I didn't do that. I keep all my, as you can imagine, all my lists of all the directions I could go. I haven't learned enough about saints. I will also say that when most of this work was done, I was in Aix-en-Provence, France, which have these like little, they're called oratoires. They're little like saints and helpers up on the corners of buildings, because this was one of the places where the plague existed. So whether I was working on this, I was always looking up, I was like, oh my gosh, who's that now? So then I had to acquire a book on who they all are, and I learned them all at the same time. And I thought, well, maybe I could put those in there, depending on where my location was. I had to put a stop to some of it. There were other things. I limited myself to 6 to 8:30 in the morning for this project. And I was not allowed to touch it at any other time. Otherwise, I would never have gotten anything else done. So there were a lot of rigidity. I was nomadic. I was in a nomadic place, and I think this really helped me. This and coffee. I think it became, that's why I showed that picture. Coffee, my Pseudocools, and my dog isn't in the picture. We're all there, and my pens. It was a process.
I don't understand how the impact of the saints. How do you unpack the saint into your syntax?
Yeah, I didn't know what to do with that.
Is it spiritual or is it visual, the fact that they're working particularly?
Well, it became something that I was so surprised to find in the newspaper every day. I was looking at the difference between stories that were the same story told in French and English, and then what was on those. I was interested in that part of the newspaper where everything is sort of solvable or, concrete, and then everything else that wasn't. So you could solve a puzzle. You knew what the weather was. You knew when the sun was going to come up. All that information is in all these drawings. When the sun goes down, who the saint is, it's all there. There appears to be a spiritual side to me, which got tested many times when I walked the Camino de Santiago de Compostela, which was, all about, if you know what this is, it's a pilgrimage walk. And I ran into a lot of saints there, lots of different representations of them. And I liked the idea that they all had a purpose. The one you were mentioning over here, the one that protects hunters, the one that protects, all sorts of different things. So I became interested in that. It's like a player in my story, because I tell stories.
So it's kind of like an infinite quality about the spirituality of them that kind of drives a certain aesthetic? Or?
Yeah, and some saints seem to, sometimes I'd choose a piece of paper based on the saint, because it seemed like this was the right color paper. I loved the idea that I could be arbitrary, because let me tell you, when you're trying to build 3D models of fragments from the 17th century and you're trying to take, 250 pictures and then use photogrammetry equations to build the 3D models, you've got to be just perfect, and you've got to get all of that mathematical information working right. And since at the same time, I think it's easier for me where I am now to say it's really nice to be arbitrary and have a structure at the same time.
Yeah, I think faith is like that, unknowables, inequalities.
Right.
Gödel's incompleteness then applied to spiritual, unknowable things.
Yes. I'm there.
Thank you very much for coming.